This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this!
Hello and welcome back everyone to the Xcast. The truth is in here. I'm your host Tony Black and we're back for Season 5. Our Season 5 coverage begins right here as we start talking about Redux Part 1, the first of a two-part opener to this exciting new season. Well, I say new season of the Xcast, but the X-Files has been around for quite a while. But joining me on this continued odyssey through the world of Fox Mulder and Dana Scully is once again Darren Mooney.
Hi, how are things? I was just going to say, if this is your, if this is new to you, you've done an excellent job contextualizing the X-Files, considering that, you last week you thought Mulder had committed suicide and the show was over. I'm really, really impressed with that.
Yeah, here's the 5-season in twist on the Xcast. Tony's never watched the X-Files before. This is his first go.
Everything that you thought you knew, listener, is wrong. It's actually a lie. Don't worry, I've got a big speech prepared,
Yeah.
So when Tony first prepared the Xcast, the fear in podcasting community was not for safety at home, but for armistice and treaty. The business of podcasting isn't business, Tony. It's spoilers. Sorry. Anyway.
Yeah, I've gone full Scott Osselhoff on you all these years. But we'll get to all this. But yeah, it's really nice to be back for the new season of the Xcast. We're going to be obviously aiming to go weekly as we go through the 20 episodes of Season 5 with a few supplemental episodes and special episodes and roundtable discussions along the way before we reach Fight the Future next year. The first X-Files movie, obviously, which puts us pretty much squarely in the middle of the whole Xcast journey, which is really exciting and a little bit terrifying. So it's an exciting season to come. Before we start, Darren, talking about Redux, what you're a fan of Season 5, I think, aren't you? What do you think about this, 5th season, the sort of midpoint, shall we say, of the X-Files as a whole?
I actually really, really like the 5th season. It's probably my third favourite season of the X-Files overall, and it's interesting because it's not necessarily like the 3rd season and the 8th season, which are my two favourite seasons, where they're kind of like cohesive singular entities that have like a strong theme that runs from beginning to end and a strong idea of where they're going when they start. The 5th season is a lot messier, I think, in terms of plot, in terms of story, in terms of how it starts and where it ends up, and in particularly, ironically, in terms of where it has to line up with the film that the production team shot the previous summer, which is one of the more interesting tensions that runs through the 5th season. But it is the show, for me, it's the intersection of just the show being kind of at the perfect point. It's evolved to the point where it's become one of the most cinematic shows on television. The visuals this year, the storytelling, it's absolutely astounding and amazing. It's become a cultural phenomenon, so you start seeing guest writers coming in. I know that Stephen King's Chinga is a divisive episode, but I absolutely love Gibson's episode Kill Switch. I think it's one of the best episodes of The X-Files because it shows just the sheer breadth of what you can get away with on the show at this point in time. And at the same time, while it's pushing forward, you haven't yet kind of crossed the threshold where you end up in Los Angeles, which fundamentally alters the dynamic of the show. And I mean, obviously, all the stuff that happens behind the scenes involved with that, but even just the mechanics of kind of swapping out Vancouver for kind of the west coast of America with its deserts and its sunlight and its long days. That has a kind of a palpable impact on the show's atmosphere and tone. I don't have a huge problem with the 6th season. I like the 6th season a lot. In particular, I think the first stretch of the 6th season is absolutely remarkable. I think the first, 8 or 10 episodes of the 6th season actually hold up really well. I think that it begins to creak a little bit after that. But I do think that when the show moves from Vancouver to Los Angeles, something is lost. So for me, the 5th season exists at that perfect kind of pinnacle point of we figured out how to do the X-Files really well. and we're still in Vancouver, so we still have that rich atmosphere there. And just like the quality of the individual episodes within them, the amount of experimentation going on, you start seeing the show playing with things like, say, Unusual Suspects, in a couple of weeks, or, if you were David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson, the production team, last week before you started shooting the first episode of the season. And then even stuff like Travelers, where you start seeing the show kind of branching out and playing with kind of like extended flashbacks. And on top of that, it has two of my favorite mythology episodes of the show, which are, Patient X and Red and the Black. But even then, even the standout episodes, even sort of the non-standout episodes, like even stuff like Schizogyny, for all its very, 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 very obvious misfires, is still absolutely fascinating and engaging. Stuff like All Souls, which I'm not a big fan of, is still doing something ambitious. But even things like, say, the Pine Bluff variant, which is just a really well-executed episode of television that is, I would argue the best script that John Chaban's written. So for me, it's an example of the show and its production firing on all cylinders just through a season, and just producing a season that, for me at least, holds up really, really well. I say that having not rewatched a lot of it, so I'm quite looking forward to when we get to the end, when we quite literally get to the end, and you go, so how was the season for you, Darren? And I go, well, actually, Tony, turns out I was completely wrong.
I don't think you will be, to be honest. I think what you say is absolutely on the money, really. I think it's one of those seasons where it's funny, going into season 4, which I didn't do a lot of, really, on the Xcast, as people who listen regularly will know. My appearances on that season were fleeting. More fleeting than I planned originally, but for various different reasons, I was only in, I think, 3 of the 24 episodes or whatever it was. But partly, I found less enthusiasm going into that season as I do when I looked at season 5 and I was like, oh, well, I've got to be on that one. I really want to do that one. I really want to do that one. And I was like, wow, actually, I really want to do at least half of this season. And I was surprised when I looked back, because I was like, I don't remember loving season 5 at the time quite that much, but now I look back on it, I think this is definitely one of my favourite seasons, because there is a real balance of some really great standalone stories, tonally in terms of genre. The show is doing all kinds of different things.
Yeah.
And it has some, really compelling mythology episodes, even though, like you say, they're all sort of building up towards the movie in their own right. They're all very different. And I think it just holds up really well, as a season of The X-Files, which, like you say, hasn't quite gone in the new-ish direction it does when they, post-movie. But also, I think it has a little bit more verve to it, a little bit more going on than the previous season did. And I wouldn't have said that years ago.
I think that one of the advantages that the 5th season has over the 4th, and I apologise for fans of the 4th season because I know there are a lot of them, and I mean, I would count myself, I like it a lot as well. When we did the wrap-up of the end of the 4th season, we discussed that how it has these amazing highs. Like, again, I think that there are more 4th season episodes in my top 10 episodes of The X-Files than from any other season. But at the same time, those are contrasted with incredible lows. And the point is, you don't just, get them in chunks. You bounce between them like a ping pong. You're bouncing from one end of the table to the next. You're doing Paper Hearts, and then you're doing, Tunguska and Turma. You're doing, you've got Teliko and Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. You've got these episodes that are really great, sitting right next to these episodes that are among some of the worst stuff the show has ever done. And it's got this incredible kind of all over the placeness to it. And even in terms of focus, because I mean, you mentioned sort of tonal focus. We'll probably talk about this when we talk about the episode itself. The 5th season doesn't necessarily have a strong, singular narrative through line. And again, this is one of the tensions that has always existed with the X-Files, and this is one of the rare points where I think maybe it becomes a problem. But even allowing for that, the 5th season has a much stronger sense of... It has a great deal of tonal variance, but it has a much stronger sense of theme in what it's about than the 4th season does. Because the 4th season, Carter's attention is split between, he's off in Hawaii with Spotnitz writing the feature film. Or he's also working on the first season of Millennium, which has 20-odd episodes as well. So, he's not necessarily running the show as tightly as he had at its peak. Whereas in the 5th season, now Morgan and Wong have been drafted in to run the X-Files so that Carter can come over and bring his attention full-time to the X-Files, so he can basically take a run at the movie. You have this kind of tighter focus, and you see these themes that repeatedly bubble through this season, which is this idea of children, and this idea of warped children, and the idea of the relationship that exists between parents and children, which has obviously been a theme of the show going back to the very beginning, but which plays out in more interesting ways. So you have this idea of like monstrous children, like even Schizogyny, which is the Murderous Trees episode, is about the gap that exists between parents and children. The Postmodern Prometheus is about a child who desperately wants to be understood by a father who never wanted to have him. You have Emily happening with Scully at the same time. You have The Spenders with Cassandra and her son Jeffrey and the dynamic that exists between the two. You have Mulder, who's working through his relationship with the man who he discovered may actually be his father. And you have all this stuff happening and simmering through in a way that gives the season like a consistency of focus. I mean, even we mentioned the Stephen King episodes and the Gibson episodes, which are, you know, in theory as far removed from anything the show has ever done. But even in those, you have the idea of a little girl and a relationship that she has with her mother through this doll, which is incredibly toxic and poisonous. But even Kill Switch, which is about a computer, which is a child that opens the episode murdering its own father. So you have this like consistent through line of ideas that are simmering and bubbling through the show that are playing out even in these relatively standalone and self-contained episodes. And I really, really like that. I think it gives the fifth season... Well, the fifth season doesn't have the same highs as the fourth. You know, I mean, I love the Red and the Black and Patient X, and I think Bad Blood is an amazing episode of television. It also manages to just scrape by and doesn't hit the same lows, or at least when it hits the lows, they don't seem as sharp. It doesn't seem like you've been thrown off a cliff when you hit the lows in the fifth season. And I think that maybe stands to its credit.
Yeah, I think that's true. There is maybe a little bit more consistency with it, and I think there are stronger... You know, there are fewer of those episodes where you go, oh, that was rough. You know, there really are, and there are less maybe openly contentious episodes. But it's going to be exciting to go through it. You know, we've already recorded a good chunk of this season on the Xcast, and there's been some fantastic discussions happened already. So let's talk then a bit about Redux then, which is obviously the season premiere. Season premiere is split into two parts. It's part two, really, though, of the three-part story that began in Gethsemane, obviously at the end of season 4. This first episode, first aired on November the 2nd, 1997, was written by Chris Carter, as is part 2, which will be coming next week, and was directed by R.W. Goodwin. This would be the last season premiere R.W. Goodwin would direct, obviously, because he leaves at the end of season 5, or he doesn't go with them on the journey to Los Angeles, which is a shame. So, obviously, this episode picks up from the whopping great cliffhanger ending of season 4, which was Mulder's killed himself. Yeah.
Right your way out of that one.
Yeah, yeah. And as we hinted at in Gethsemane, when we recorded Gethsemane, their way out of it is interesting, to say the least. Let's just say Mulder's not dead.
Chekhov's pump action shotgun.
Mulder's not quite dead, and he ends up on his own journey into the bowels of the Department of Defense in this episode, while Scully is trying to prove, scientifically, of course, as always, connections between the conspiracy, her cancer, and, you know, dark forces within the FBI, and it all just rolls around in that one big stew. So, what would you give Redux then? And bear in mind, this episode, we're just going to talk about Redux Part 1. What would you give Part 1 of Redux out of 10?
I go with a 5.
Oh, wow, really? That is lower than I thought, Darren, I'll be honest.
It is, and I mean, like, not to spoil next week, I'm a little bit fonder of next week's episode, and everybody who listened to Gethsemane heard me rave about Gethsemane. This is very much this middle part of the trilogy syndrome that happens. And by the way, I absolutely love that, like, this is... Again, it reminds me of The Blessing Way, which I think I scored lower, which is, you know... To be fair, Redux Part 1 does include fewer Native American stereotypes, so it has that going for it. But, like, the issue... And, part of me admires this, which is, like... The X-Files is coming back from its biggest ever cliffhanger. If you look at the ratings, Redux 1 is actually the second most watched episode of the X-Files, following on from obviously Leonard Betts, which had the advantage of airing directly after the Super Bowl. This is the show at the peak of its popularity. They've just filmed a movie during the summer. The trade papers are all over it. The New Yorker's written a cartoon about it. There's massive coverage absolutely everywhere. Everybody's eyes are glued to the set. And it's like, what are you going to get? What are you going to give us, Chris? This is it. Your biggest audience. You're going to open in front of like a crowd that's just eager to jump on board that X-Files train. And it's Mulder walking through a bunch of corridors with a lot of monologuing happening over it.
A lot of corridors. A lot.
And a lot of monologue.
Yeah.
I've joked before that this is Chris Carter's version of an Aaron Sorkin script. There's a lot of walk and talk. It's just not a lot of conversation. And it's, part of me admires Carter's willingness to kind of go all in and be uncompromising and, like, not to pander. Because there's that great story that Kevin Smith tells about the first time he tried to watch The X-Files, which was after its second season when he'd heard great things about it. So he tuned in, watched The Blessing Way, and was like, what the hell is going on? People pointed me towards this? And I can imagine Redux 1 having that sort of effect on people who are like, people have been talking about the X-Files show all summer, you know? And there's a lot of press coverage, there's a movie coming, I'm going to jump on board that train. And then you sit down and it opens. Like, Carter doesn't even, put sugar on the pill. It opens with Mulder monologuing, I've held a torch in the darkness to glance upon a truth unknown. An act of faith began with an eloquent certainty that my journey promised the chance, not just of understanding, but of recovery. It's a very sweet bit of writing, but it's not necessarily something that grabs you immediately and viscerally. So I do admire it on those terms, and I do actually have a great deal of affection for it on those terms. But at the same time, it is a lot of walking through corridors. It is a lot of monologuing over people walking through corridors. It is a lot of exposition delivered very heavily. And this is probably where I get really controversial and a bunch of your listeners start throwing stuff at the wall. I apologize. But it's the point where the show... certain parts of the show's mythology almost begin eating their own tail, and I think that becomes a problem as the show comes on, and I think you can trace a lot of it back to here. Now, I'm not going to be entirely negative. There's a lot I like about this, and there's a lot I like about next week's episode, but that is kind of why I would grade the episode as low as I have.
Well, I mean, yeah, this has been infamous for many years, hasn't it, as the monologue episode, you know. I mean, this is Chris Carter's flowery, writing at length. This is about as flowery as it gets in many ways, and there are other episodes obviously that repeat this trick or incorporate aspects of this. Things like Emily, at the start of Emily, and then going into like season 8. But this is the overload for monologues.
You have Scully monologuing about Mulder monologuing as we watch Mulder walk through corridors, which is like, again, I admire the commitment to what it's doing.
Yeah,
it's a lot.
It is a lot. It is a lot, and it's one of those things that I don't think that any TV show would get away with now. Without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, it's indulgent even for then. And even for the X-Files, it's pretty indulgent. It's and as a season premiere, if anything, I'd say it shows a show that is confident in itself.
Yes,
because
absolutely.
How many series 5 seasons in, would really think an episode full of monologues where one character, let's say, walks around a building for the entire episode is enough, and that they're confident that the viewers are here, the viewers are coming back. And there is also, I suppose, the looming spectre of the possibility this is the final season. So they are, at this point anyway, so they're thinking, well, who cares? We're just going to do what we want at this point. So I think there is a lot in it that is a bit silly, quite flowery, very indulgent. I think I like it a little bit more than you, though. I think I'd give it more about a 6, because not vastly more than you, but I think I like a lot of what I always really like, and what I think gets the 6 for me is the Mulder and Critchgau scene, which we'll talk more about later, because that's by far and away the best scene in the whole episode, and it's
one of the best things the show has ever done, I would argue, as well.
Yeah, it's great. It's really, really good. And a lot of shows and a lot of things have taken a cue from that over the years in certain ways. And I think it's just the core component of an episode which is trying to carve out some space to really sort of explore, almost in a novelistic fashion, the sort of inner monologue, the inner thoughts of characters who've reached an impasse. And a story that has reached a crossroads, of its own making, admittedly. It didn't have to go down this direction at all, but it has. And it's self-reflecting and self-analysing what it is, kind of what the show is and where it's going to go in this season. And I like that level of fairly casual introspection, even if it kind of cheats its way out of a lot of stuff, and especially as we get into season 5, midway through, it sort of reverses all of this anyway, so
not only does it reverse all of this anyway, like Carter wrote the feature film during the summer, Carter wrote the feature film during the 4th season and filmed it during the summer. It's not as if he wrote this and like sat down in the middle of the 5th season and said, this isn't working, I need to change my mind. He wrote this knowing full well that like, but in the space of, not even 12 months, in 9 months, he would have to basically get back to starting point from what he does here. Which, like, again, is a move that I admire. Like, as you pointed out, as a piece of self-confidence and as, like, a willingness to you do you sort of thing. Like, it is very much like a Carter move. And, like, again, Carter, you could argue Carter is one of the forefathers of, like, the modern TV auteur. He's a showrunner who is primarily interested in what interests him, which I kind of admire the purity of that vision. But at the same time, there's a part of me that when I watch Redux 1 and Redux 2, I go, really?
Yeah.
This is it? This is what you're doing? And I admire it, but I understand that as well as I do that this can't work, Chris.
Yeah. Exactly. And I don't think that's the thing. It's one of the things where, and we've talked about this at length before on this podcast, but it's one of the things where you can always tell when Frank Spotnitz has a heavier hand in the mythology episodes, because there is a lot more plot, there is a lot more momentum, there is a lot more of the the story thriller aspects to it, whereas Carter just likes to sort of pootle around and explore ideas and have characters monologue in, and he does it again in My Struggle, the first My Struggle, which I always think reminds me of Redux whenever I watch that.
Oh, it absolutely does.
It's very similar.
Redux is like the platonic ideal of the X-Files for us, like for a certain mindset of kind of Carter, I think. Like it's the one that he keeps coming back to. And so that when Spotnitz was asked to write comics for Wildstorm back in the 2000s, he went back to Redux 1 and Redux 2 as well, seeing them as a golden age for the show. And again, I respect that and I admire that. And again, it's worth noting we just came out of Gethsemane, which is a similar episode in a lot of respects. It's Carter being introspective, it's Carter being monologue-y, it's Carter playing with big ideas more than he's playing with plot and action. And I absolutely love that there. So I do feel a little bit churlish when I get to Redux 1. I'm like, okay, that's enough. But it does a little bit. There's just something missing here that I think was present in Gethsemane.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that Gethsemane had a bit more heft to it and a bit more weight and a little bit more of a sort of mythic substance to it, whereas Redux is a little bit... let's walk around and talk, let's walk and talk. Let's give you a PowerPoint presentation of the X-Files for like 40 minutes. And it is. It's one of those things...
You guys like Oliver Stone, right?
Exactly. It is JFK in miniature, and that's great in one. It is great in one perspective, but in another, it's just it is very much like you say, the X-Files eats itself really. But we'll get into this. It is at the very least an interesting episode, and
yes, absolutely.
On IMDb, obviously, we always have a look at those aggregate ratings. It got out of 2,596 votes. What do you think, Darren? I always like to ask you this. What do you think, as a rough guesstimate, Redux probably got?
Okay, mythology episodes tend to rank high. We're still at this point in the show where it's early and popular and people like these episodes. And it kind of has, if you are... There's a lot in here to like, as you and I discussed there. So I'm going to say over 8. I'm going to say, will it hit 8.5? Let's go over 8.5. Let's go with, I love that you can hear my thought. This is literally my thought process happening in front of you, listener. Let's go with an 8.8.
Oh, bingo!
What?
Bingo! Absolutely spot on. You got an 8.8. Well done. Excellent. It is, I don't think you've ever done that before. I don't think you've ever guessed it straight off. So that's pretty good. It's all the hours of training you've had when I've asked you this over the last few years, Darren. You will be probably a little bit surprised to learn that Redux 1 is in the top 5 of the entire season on IMDb.
Okay, well, that's only top 25%, to be fair.
Yeah, it's not top, obviously, but it's it beats a lot of other things. It beats a lot of other things you would expect to do better. Like, it beats Patient X and the Red and the Black. It beats...
I want to talk about that.
Yeah, it beats the postmodern Prometheus, which I know is a little bit controversial these days, but it's still very popular by a lot of people. You know, it beats Unusual Suspects, which is coming soon with us, and lots of things. So it's surprising. You know, you would think this would have... Given, I remember at the time how a lot of critics, I remember back in the 90s, thought that it was a bit ponderous and a bit rubbish. I'm surprised it's done that well as an aggregate.
Hated it in Cine Fantastic. Although it is worth noting that it aired, I think, when Fox did a marathon in 1999 of fans' favourite episodes, the trilogy won the fan favourite trilogy, which is always struck me as interesting. I assumed that Anasazi would have had that in the bag, but it's fascinating. That always kind of surprised me. There is a lot of love out there for this.
There really is. That's true.
Which is why I feel really bad.
Well, let's dig a little deeper and explore why we think the way we do then. So, let's talk more in depth about Redux. So, to kick it off, we've kind of got to resolve the final problem, shall we say. Mulder's Reichenbach falls, right? We've got to figure this out, haven't we? Because it begins with a teary Mulder, and we're at the point where we were at the end of Gethsemane, which is where we left him, where he was crying, and then Scully drops the bombshell of, "Oh, he's dead!" to the FBI. But obviously we know he's not. And he gets out of it through a little bit of luck, a little bit of creative, flowery writing from Carter. I mean, what do you think? I mean, obviously, because ultimately, Scott Ostelhoff is this guy who's surveilling Mulder upstairs. Mulder realises, goes upstairs, shoots him in the face, because that's obviously what you do straight away. Shoot someone in the face so much that their face is so unrecognisable you can't identify them. I mean,
shoot him in the temple and then shoot him in the face, which is like...
Exactly. And bear in mind, he didn't presumably use Ostelhoff's shotgun for this. He used his own gun. The shotgun I might have believed, but like...
Did he not use the shot? I thought he used... I thought Skinner's ballistic report reports that it was a gunshot wound to the temple, which was Mulder's weapon, and then he used the pump-action shotgun.
Oh, yes, he did. You're right. Absolutely. Actually, yeah, you're right. Even so, I mean... Is this...
That's it. I'm now enjoying the mental image of Mulder trying with a regular gun to basically,
they don't show you, do they? They don't show you the point where he's killed him, and then he gets the gun, and he's like, right, better finish him off.
What's the thought process running through Mulder's head at that moment in time? It's like, well, you know what would be really handy? If he didn't have a face, I'm going to take his face.
Oh, this is the thing, right? Like, in that split second, has he cooked up this entire plan to mask his own suicide? You know, and that's the thing. It's a real leap, because you've either he did it in the spur of the moment after he's killed him, or he goes down and has that conversation with Scully, goes and then thinks, right, how am I going to do this? I better go back up and shoot him in the face.
My apartment,
Right.
I'll go back up where I've got this dead body, shoot him in the face, so my neighbours will hear two gunshots, like several hours apart, presumably. Because part of me is wondering, like, assuming Mulder did it at the time and kind of had this plan thought up, what the hell happens if he gets to Scully's apartment, which, by the way, he just shotgunned somebody in the face, so presumably he also changed, right? Because he's not completely covered in blood splatter like some 80s serial killer movie villain. So, you know, he gets there, he has a little flirty keep going FBI woman moment, which is a strange read in hindsight, but anyway, we'll brush past that. But what happens if at that moment in time, when he's like, Scully, I have a cunning plan, and Scully goes, Mulder, you're out of your mind. No. What's the point at which Mulder goes, but I just shotgunned a guy in the face?
Yeah.
Like, what's my backup here?
I'm kind of committed. Yeah, I'm kind of on this path already, Scully.
This is why you always ask, do you trust me first?
Yeah. You know, he's on this path. He's kind of got to go with it. It's one of those things, I suppose, isn't it, from a writing point of view, when you write yourself into a corner, I think you have to cut a few corners to get yourself out of that corner, and I think this one is particularly.
I think I would argue that the gap between Redux 1 and Redux 2 is even more of a corner-cuttery cliffhanger. Not to get too spoilery, but we didn't look in the bottom of this thing that we examined. It's a really lame way of trying to sneak your way out of a cliffhanger.
Yeah, it's true. And I think that kind of thing is a little bit of a convenience, I suppose, but this is more... You can tell that Carter, I don't think, had figured out how to get Mulder out of this when he was writing Gethsemane, and when they were producing Gethsemane, you really got the feeling that he got back in for season 5, and he went, right, how do I get him out of this?
You say that, right? You say that, but like, to give Carter some ounce of credit, I would argue that Gethsemane spends I wasn't joking when I said Chekhov's pump action shotgun. Like. Gethsemane does spend an inordinate amount of time stressing that this guy doesn't use a regular gun. No. He uses the kind of weapon that could take a man's face off. Which if I'm giving credit to Carter, suggests that he at least had, and it's a really strange angle to have, like, going into your cliffhanger, but that, like, at least Carter's starting point was, at the very least, Mulder shotguns a guy's face off. And we do that by setting up the shotgun in the first part of this 3-part episode. I do like, actually, it's worth remarking, one of the things that kind of struck me on rewatch, actually, to give, and this is something I find interesting, I'm kind of curious on your thoughts on, is the sequence where Mulder is watching that television. He takes out his gun and he loads his gun. Are we supposed to intuit that if Kritzkow hadn't have called him at that moment in time, if Mulder hadn't looked up and hadn't seen that camera at that exact moment, would Mulder have taken his own life?
I did think that, actually. Yeah, I hadn't really considered that before, but when I watched this again, I was like, actually, would he have done it? You know, would he have actually shot himself? Would he have killed himself? It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because on the one hand, he is the kind of character, I think I may have said this in the Gethsemane, but he is the kind of character who you could imagine doing something like that, because he's a man of extremes in many ways. But yeah, I don't know. I just think this whole solution is, extremely contrived. It just about gets away with it, I think.
But it helps that it leans into the crazy. It helps that, this is an episode where there's a lot of walking and talking, but the opening 5 minutes go like the clapper. It doesn't give you any time to stop or think, geez. It doesn't give you time when you're watching the episode to think, wait, did Mulder premeditatedly shoot the guy's face off in case he decided that he wanted to do this? Or did he come back and do it later? Was it a 2-step job? Did he change his clothes? Did he shower before he came over to visit Scully? Did he shower in Scully's bathroom? Is Scully going to open her laundry tomorrow and discover some very unpleasant surprises waiting for her? From Mulder's kind of, blood-soaked, top or whatever he's got in there. The episode moves fast enough through those opening points that you don't have time to stop and think about them. And I think that's to its credit. I think that's to Carter's credit. And particularly when you consider how, I'm not going to say slow, but how contemplative the rest of that episode is. I think it's quite a clever and canny piece of writing on Carter's behalf.
Yeah, one of the ththings I was thinking of as I was watching this, and as the episode was sort of unfurling, and you start to get the monologues happen, and you get, it returning to the FBI and to characters like, obviously, Skinner coming back into it, and then Section Chief Blevins, good old Blevo, hashtag Team Blevo, coming back again, and it's like, it's one of those things where I was struck by how obviously Redux is working to try and tie a thread between the pilot episode and this, and everything that sort of has happened over the last 5 years. In the thinking process of, when I watched this, I was thinking, this feels like the premiere of a season that knows it's its final year. That at the time really has sort of its eye on the fact that this is it. This is the end. We're heading towards the end now. and that we're going to start layering in things. You know, you find this in so many TV shows, don't you, Darren? I mean, you've seen many, many things. There always tends to be, when you get to the end of a TV show, traditionally,
you want to look back.
Connective tissue, exactly. And, you know, they do this again at the end of season 7, don't they, with Requiem? You know,
well, they do this throughout season 7 as well. Well, this very sort of funereal atmosphere running through it as well, which is this, like, is it the end? Is it undead? Are there going to be zombies? There are probably going to be zombies because this isn't actually the end. Yeah, the 7th season is a fascinating season of television.
Yeah, and it does a lot of that, and then you literally have the episode which goes back to Bellflower, Oregon, and goes back to the pilot in a more of a literal sense, whereas this one is calling back to aspects of the pilot with Blevins and the other guy, who I can never remember his name. What's his name? The other dude, the one with the glasses.
The guy with the glasses.
That guy, whoever he is, the other FBI guy. And
the guy who used Blevo's extension.
Yeah,
I think Blevo was framed.
Yeah.
I mean, Holly just suggests that it was the extension that was being wrong, and we see Blevo's, counterpoint using the extension later in the episode. I think Team Blevo forever. I think Blevo's a misunderstood character.
I do. I think he's a cuddly old grandpa. We've said this before. He's like Santa. He's the X-Files Santa. But the other guy is Senior Agent, played by Ken Camrew.
I can see why you didn't remember his name.
Yeah, exactly right. You've got those aspects that tie back, but this, I don't know about you, but it just really felt like that with Redux. It felt like that it was working hard to obviously sort of recontextualize the lie that Mulder has sort of heard, and try. I mean, there's one line, isn't there, during the Critch game monologue where it's a little bit of a self-aware line from Carter where Mulder says, yeah, but I've seen aliens. I've seen all this stuff.
Yeah.
And Critchgate says, you've seen what they wanted you to see. And that might as well be a conversation between us and Chris Carter, with Carter playing Critchgate and going, well, yeah, but don't worry.
Yeah, don't ask too many questions.
Yeah.
Don't worry about all those conversations with characters, when Mulder wasn't around. Exactly. And stuff like that. They were just very into character. They were just like ad-libbing, really. That's what was happening in those scenes. But yeah, this is the thing about the season. I don't see it quite the same way that you do. I think it is calling back to the first season. And I think that what's interesting is that you have that in the fourth season as well, with like the character of Max and the mention of Scully's thesis, and obviously, sort of with the return of Blevo, the much lauded return of Blevo in Gethsemane. And don't worry, I want to come back to the relationship between Blevo and Senior Agent and First Elder and our man in the FBI, because I think there's a lot to unpack about the state of the conspiracy in this particular episode.
There is.
But in terms of that, like calling back to the first season, what's interesting for me about the fifth season, and it kind of ties into that theme that I mentioned that, if I'm on during this kind of fifth season, you will not hear me shut up talk about, which is this idea of monstrous children and this idea of like enfant terrible, and this sort of idea of like grotesque offspring that have become things that you cannot predict or control, and that they're, disastrous and they're probably going to kill you. And what's interesting is that I think Carter at this stage knew that he had originally wanted there to be 5 seasons. Like 100 episodes for syndication, which is great because that means the show will still be alive. Then his plan was to transition into a franchise of movies, which is great. But I think Fox at this point had made it clear that they wanted the film franchise, hypothetically, and the television series to run side by side. And that he was going to be coming back for a kind of a 6th season. I think it was an open secret around this point in time. So you have, running through the 5th season, and you see it particularly in episodes like Postmodern Prometheus, you have Carter dealing with this idea that what he created and what he envisaged didn't turn out exactly in the way that he had intended it to. And I mean, you can argue that in Postmodern Prometheus, the evil scientist character with his crop of blonde white hair, and his penchant for monologuing, perhaps could be seen as a stand-in character for one of our most beloved showrunners in the history of the series, which would make the Great Mutado, who is this monstrous warped thing which is not at all what his creator intended, but is still amazing and fun and poppy and great, could be read then as a stand-in for the show itself, which became something so much more than Carter had intended it to be. And when you listen to Carter talking in interviews, he repeatedly comes back to the Redux trilogy And he points to the Redux trilogy as the moment, and there's a point where some commentators will punch the air. Some of our listeners are going to be punching the air when I say this, and some of them are going to end up crying into their hands. So cheers to the person who's punching the air, and sorry to the person who's crying into their hands. But Carter's observation about Redux, the Redux trilogy, is that it's the moment that he realized the mythology practically wrote itself. It could just keep going and going and going and going. That there was no finite end to it. That there was no point at which the show was kind of done. That he could just keep doing this and telling these sort of stories indefinitely in multiple forms, no matter how no matter what happened, no matter what ideas came into his head. That the show was malleable and prone to change and warp. And I think that is, on one hand, I agree with the person crying into their hands, because that's a very serious problem with the show. And not to be too cynical or too kind of like down on Redux, but even in Redux, you could already see the show repeating itself, already playing some of the greatest hits. Because like in Redux, you already have another, oh my god, can we trust Skinner story arc happening, which is a well that the show keeps going back to. It was very effective when Skinner was introduced, and Mitch Pileggi's great at it, and you can see why the show keeps going back to it, because Pileggi is great at it. But at the same time, it's something the show has already done and should be done and dusted at this point, but won't be done and dusted for like another 4 seasons. And then you also have like the obvious idea of the show. You have the template that was established by Memento Mori, which was nominated for an outstanding writing Emmy, and which won Gillian Anderson her outstanding actress Emmy, and deservedly so on both counts. But you have that establishing what becomes a template for the show going forward, which is the Mulder do action, Scully be in hospital plot, which happens to...
It's true.
It's
true.
A staple. Yeah, it very much happens... in Redux 2, very obviously, where Scully is in hospital and Mulder is very much like dynamic and around and investigating. Even here, like while Scully's like trapped in a meeting room, Mulder's running around inside the DOD. But even like later in the season, you have it happen with Emily as well, where Scully is in hospital, but she's in hospital with somebody else, while Mulder is running around beating people up and having action sequences. But even like if you go to the relaunched kind of series, even if you go to like My Struggle 2. Like, you have that Scully, again, is in hospital. She's not for herself this time. She's actually working on investigating the disease. But Mulder is, like, sort of dosed out of his mind, driving across the country, pointing guns at people and yelling at the cigarette-smoking man, while Scully is, like, in a hospital again, doing very serious, very dramatic stuff, very sort of, like, earnest kind of, sort of take me seriously, dramatically stuff, while Mulder's like, I'm going to start sweating a lot and pointing a gun. This is going to be great fun. And with Redux, you can really sort of see that happening. The show kind of realizing that it can, to a certain extent, again, the title Redux, it can replay these ideas, it can remix them, it can play them out again and again and again, and that's a little bit exhausting, and why I'm very skeptical of the two-parter as a whole, and that's the person crying into their hands. Now, the person who punched the air, I also totally see where you're coming from, and also totally am on side with you, because it takes a shed load of courage to do what this show does in Redux and Redux 2, which is basically to say, by the way, everything that we told you for the past 4 seasons, it's not true. Or it might not be true. Or it's possibly true. Some of it may be true. Some of it may be false. Who really knows? Anything is up for grabs. Which I admire the gumption of doing, of just throwing all that doubt into the air and just like letting it settle. I don't think it was ever going to last on the show. I don't think that like the status quo is set up in Redux was ever going to be something the show would run with, and we might talk about that in a little bit, because I don't think it's a limitation of the X-Files, but I do think it's a factor of the X-Files that makes something like this very difficult to do logistically, which is the fact that we talked about how the show is... The X-Files isn't really one show. The X-Files is more like a bunch of different shows written by different people who approach the characters in different ways. So Vince Gilligan's episodes are Vince Gilligan episodes. Darren Morgan's episodes are Darren Morgan episodes. The Wongs write their own episodes. Carter writes his own episodes. And they all play with templates, and they all, exist within the same continuity, and they occasionally interact with one another, but they have very distinct aesthetics and very distinct worldviews. And that's a strength of the show. That's something I love about the show. But it does mean that Carter can't shake up the show in the way that he wants to do with Redux 1 and Redux 2, because that would mean shaking up the show that Vince Gilligan's writing. That would mean, shaking up the show that the rest of the staff are working on. And that's something that, and I think it's to Carter's credit because he respects his writers so much and allows them a great deal of freedom to do what they want to do. Carter's not willing to do that. So when Redux 1 and Redux 2 completely change everything that you ever thought you knew about the X-Files, that's only until you hit the first Monster of the Week episode, in which case everything is back to normal and you're back to factory settings. And despite the fact that Mulder has had this huge crisis of faith, and Scully's had this huge journey towards faith, they're still back in the traditional believer and skeptic roles, because that's the archetype that you're playing with. And the show isn't so elastic that Carter can kind of do what Redux 1 and Redux 2 seem to suggest they're doing in their strongest or most ambitious or most audacious moments. Sorry, this turned into my own walking through corridor moments. I hope people listen to this on headphones as they're walking through long grey corridors.
We should have said that. That's a something you have to do. Yeah, you have to only listen to this episode while walking down a long corridor. No, it's absolutely right. I mean, as you were saying that, I was thinking about how it's one of those things where the show, I think, is afraid at points like this to actually have too much of that sort of load-bearing idea that if Mulder's stopped believing in, aliens, it also means he stops believing in any of the paranormal, because when he's down in Florida, and he's with Scully and he's investigating Ponce de Leon or whatever. Yeah, he's fine with that. Oh yeah, Fountain of Youth, brilliant. He's fine with a Frankenstein's monster in the American heartland. He's fine with another pusher on the loose. All these different
Murderous
things that
trees,
happen.
Which you feel would be a bit of a push for anybody who isn't at peak Mulder levels of believability.
Exactly. AI that, uploads your consciousness into the web and all this kind of thing. He's fine with all this. What he now doesn't believe in is aliens. So it's like a selective thing, that defines. It's Carter being afraid to sort of tackle the bigger idea. But I think what it also this episode sort of shows as well is that Carter's not really particularly interested in the mythology, I think, too much from a plot point of view.
Yeah.
I think, in many ways, the story that he wrote that is most in tune with that is probably Fight the Future, because it by definition is a movie and it has to have a narrative. It has to have lots of these different aspects to it. But
it also has to be the most X-Files-y thing ever.
Yeah,
it by definition.
Bring everything together that you know about the show. Whereas, when you get a Carter solo mythology episode, a lot of the time he's more interested in what he's trying to talk about, and he's definitely more interested than anything that some of the other mythology writers, particularly Spotnitz, wanted to do, which was to create this sort of overarching mythology that made some level of sense and had some level of internal continuity. He wasn't bothered about that. And Redux shows that he's more interested in the idea behind what is truth, what is faith, what do they mean when they combine with each other, and the idea of this alternate history. He's very interested in these, which is the whole Critchgau scene. And he literally has a character spell out all of the research he's presumably done about the Cold War and America's sort of underbelly secret history and all of the sins of its past and all the things that you particularly have talked about in great length on this podcast before. And it's really so overt in this episode, but it just shows that he is more interested in the ideas that underpin the X-Files a lot of the time than the actual narrative momentum of it. It's not to say he doesn't do any of that in all of his episodes, and he's not interested in that. But I think it's not where he starts. It's not. He proves that again in the revival. When he takes a lot of these similar ideas, he puts them in a late 2010s context, and doesn't give a toss about any of the mythology.
How they fit together.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile it with what came before? Chemtrails.
Don't care.
Global warming.
Don't care. And
aliens are no longer interested. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's, as you know, that sent so many fans, some of whom will be listening to this, loopy. This idea that he actually...
I can understand that, but
me too. I get it. You know, and it's one of those things where later on he actually literally does that with his own mythology, but in this episode he's doing it within the context of the X-Files. It's just interesting that he keeps coming back to this idea of, does what you accept as continuity truth, you know, the ongoing narrative that you're seeing, does it really matter?
Yeah, this is interesting because it ties back into what's happening. And again, I'm sorry, I'm a huge fan of the second season Millennium, as anybody who has listened to this, you know, the time is now will know. But the idea is that you have this, like, in the second season Millennium, you have this weird thing that's happening with its mythology, where every conspiracy ever is true, even the ones that contradict one another, which is a remarkably ambitious and more than slightly insane premise for a television show. And I think it's the show's credit that it works as well as it does, and I absolutely love that about it. The thing with the X-Files is, and this is kind of a contradiction within the Redux episodes, and where I get to why I love these episodes, because I do love these episodes, but also why I don't love these episodes, because I also contradictory. It's like Mulder's aliens belief. Sometimes I love this episode, and sometimes I don't. But you have this idea that, like, the show negating its own mythology while watching it and knowing that by this point in the show's run, the X-Files is never actually going to negate its own mythology to that degree. It is too... And again, this is something where people complain about the mythology not being clear or not being structured or not making sense. And while, as we kind of discussed, there are internal, you know, contradictions about things like how the black oil works, for example, or who knows what when... Like, I think that generally speaking, Carter has a fairly clear idea of, like, what he's writing about, even if he doesn't necessarily have the finer details all worked out from the very beginning. So it's very highly unlikely the show would ever completely abandon kind of that stuff, in a sense of, like, say, everything that you heard doesn't actually matter. Because even when he does that in My Struggle and My Struggle 2, like, that's in part because he's already finished twice, like, his mythologies. He's already, like, wrapped up the two separate mythologies that he's done already, and he's like, okay, sit down, doing a third one. It's basically Carter's third bash at the mythology. And so, like, it's not completely negating what came before, because the cigarette-smoking man is still there, he's still this big evil, and, you know, there's still a conspiracy going on, and there's still all these archetypal trappings. So the show is never going to completely abandon all of that. It's never going to completely walk away from the idea of aliens, even if it's going to eventually contradict itself about, you know, what their involvement is and how, you know, how extended that is. Because everything is too structured and too rigidly defined. And again, this is I think one of the things why I loved Gethsemane and why I'm colder on the Reduxes is because, like, even in this episode you see that happen. One of the things that was most striking about, you know, Gethsemane was not just the welcome return of Blevo, beloved fan favorite character Blevo. It was the complete absence of, like, the cigarette-smoking man, the elders, the well-manicured man. Even Skinner was absent from the episode. It was a very self-contained, very intimate story, which is what you need it to be if you're going to be, well, screw that noise. Nothing actually matters. Yeah. Like, you need it to be that. Whereas what happens in Redux and Redux 2 is that you have these outside elements come in. You have again the huge influence of Oliver Stone on this. Not just in Kriskow's sort of JFK-esque monologue with the wonderful cutting and editing that's going on in there, but even things like the meeting at the racetrack, which is something that's taken from Stone's Nixon, which would have been around the same time. I think there may be similar scenes in JFK as well, but where you have the first elder doing his best Marlon Brando impression, and the cigarette-smoking man kind of wading into it and kind of, like, becoming involved, which makes it clear that, like, actually, you know, the show is never going to seriously embrace the idea that Kriska is right, because the evidence, it isn't just that we watched episodes of the second season where we saw people with, you know, whose faces changed. It's that continuity is still present and playing out in this episode that is telling us that continuity doesn't matter, which kind of makes it difficult for me to buy, or difficult for an audience member to buy, the idea that it's going to be thrown away in the way that, you know, you can maybe get away with later on in, you know, the Revival series, where it's been so long since the truth, and so many of the other characters have been killed off, and so few of them are actually returning, that you can actually have a clean break. Whereas watching this, it's still clear that this is the same show, and so Carter can't walk away and won't walk away. And so it doesn't have the freedom that, say, the second season Millennium has to go completely off the wall and be like, all these contradictory things are true, and make sense of it because the world is chaos. Watching Redux, there's a real sense of calling the show's bluff, being entirely frank. As a fan, watching it and going, I like the ideas here, but you and I both know you can't pay these off. Like, we know that, like, you're bluffing, that if I call you on this, you're just going to back away, you're going to, like, call your blind, you're going to put down the cards that you've been holding in your hand for the past 5 years, and you're not going to, you're never actually going to commit and pull a fast one on me, you're never going to, like, push everything, you're not going to go all in on this. So it is kind of, it does feel a little bit disingenuous when you watch these episodes like that, or at least it does to me.
I keep thinking about how the title itself, what the title means, in terms of the very name Redux, which means is from Latin, and it means bring back. It means revive. And there is reducere is the actual word, and it just there's a lot about this that just feels like you've described, the show sort of eating its own tail, playing with ideas that it had done before. Carter said he wanted to tie up a lot of loose ends from the past season and play the idea that the conspiracy is a hoax and it had been done to hide various terrestrial and temporal misdeeds. And like you say, as a result, he brings in all these characters that we've seen before, part of the broader, wider conspiracy. He did originally, by the way, and I don't know how many. I'd never heard the name of this character before, but the assassin, the assassin who's with the First Elder.
Do you know his name?
Yeah, it's his name.
I can't remember his first name, but it's something Willy. Free Willy? It's not Free Willy. It's like, but it's Great Willy. It's some sort of Willy.
Great Willy. That's brilliant. It's it's Quiet Willy, which I love. I didn't know that. Played by an actor called Willie Ross, and they couldn't even be bothered to give him. He's just call him Willie. The actor's name's Willie. Call him Willie.
He doesn't have any lines. Let's call him Quiet.
Quiet Willie. Yeah, it was supposed to be
Carter. You've done it again.
It was supposed to be the actor Maurice Panich, who played the grey-haired man in various episodes. I think going back to season 3, he was the guy who killed X, the guy who shot X. But he was busy, so they had to create this guy, the grey-haired man, who I think pops up, the Quiet Willie, who I think pops up again in season 6. But it's got all these different characters coming into it, and I suppose it sort of takes a little bit away from the purity of Gethsemane. And like you said earlier, you mentioned, let's go back to the FBI stuff, because I was thinking the same, particularly about how they use Skinner here. It really is treading old ground to an extent, and I think I was when I was watching it, I was thinking, oh god, yeah, they're playing this card again. The idea that Osselhoff was calling someone at the FBI. Do you think that Skinner again? Do you think they were setting him up again, trying to get him? He'd lose his job again at this point.
There's a point at which you have to imagine there's an entire room full of people in the syndicate whose entire job is to get Skinner fired. And that's the one project they've been working on for 5 years. Yeah. And there's a point at which the cigarette smoking man is like, no, I'm cutting your Thai takeout budget until you get this done. And it's like, can we frame him for murder? You tried that!
You've done all of it. You've tried everything.
Mulder and Scully not trust him again? Really?
Yeah,
but this time Blevo's involved.
Yeah. Do you think that this is it's that they keep returning to this, like you say, because Mitch Pileggi's so good at it? But do you think it's more about trying to eke out a level of tension within this story that otherwise wouldn't be there? Because ultimately Skinner, I think, already has proven a lot that he's on their side, Yeah,
like every time this happens, Mitch Pileggi's given a moment where he's like, really, guys?
Yeah.
Really?
So, oh.
And like, no matter who he's sharing the scene with, whether it's, Gillian Anderson or David Duchovny, you're watching that and you're going, Mitch has a point. He's kind of, I feel like he has the high ground in this particular scene here. It's like, sure, you guys have been through a lot, but you're the heroes of the show, and you get to have, like, cool adventures, whereas Skinner, like, just gets thrown down a flight of stairs in a hospital every once in a while, gets shot at a restaurant. I feel like he gets a pass. Skinner gets a pass, generally speaking. But, like, what really, really gets me about this, okay, and there's several things, but the First Elder keeps referring to, and I love this, our man in the FBI, which is really odd because, like, the conspiracy has been shown to be this vast kind of tentacled entity which can get absolutely everywhere, which has such power and influence that it could even, like, plant an agent in Mulder's department, with Alex Krycek and stuff like that. But it's orchestrated one of the great cover-ups in American history. It's, as Chris Cow points out, it's even like they've reached MacArthur. They've reached all levels of American public life. And I love that, like, First Elder's like, our man in the FBI, because we just have one. Just one man. That's our guy. Which is, by the way, is why I believe that Blevo was framed, because it's clear that, special agent or supervising agent was clearly their man in the FBI.
Yeah.
And anyway, we'll talk about that when we get to Redux 2, along the lines of suspicious suicides. But anyway, but also even, it's not just that. It's the way in which the episode is like, the episode seems to want to suggest to you visually that Skinner is a suspect, because you have a lot of these scenes where people are like, somebody inside the FBI is betraying us, and who walks through the door? Skinner does. It's like, they call it an extension, and who's at that? It's just an assistant director level. Well, would Skinner be at that level? Yes. And the whole thing is, like, watching that as an audience member, you should be smart enough to know that it's never going to be Skinner. And there is literally only one other major character working in the FBI at a similar level to Skinner, who has suspiciously returned to the show after a 4-year absence. Who could it possibly be who is orchestrating this sinister operation from inside the FBI? Yeah, it is. It's not the most elegant of, like, conspiracy-themed plot lines. It's one step away from I blame the new guy. It's I blame the really old guy who hasn't been around and has suspiciously turned up at a point at which we're pointing out that somebody is in on the conspiracy here. It's like that bit in Family Guy where they have, like, Star Trek and Captain Kirk is like, it's a dangerous mission. I'm almost certain that one of us won't return. I'll be taking myself, Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy, and Ensign Ricky. And it's like, well, I wonder who's going to die on that away mission. It's like, so we've narrowed down the pool of suspects. It's Skinner or Blevo.
Or Blevin. Exactly. It's the kind of thing that they were able to make work a little bit better 2 or 3 seasons ago when, Skinner was still a bit shadowy. He was a bit mysterious. Around the Anasazi trilogy, where there's that again, Scully is suspicious, and there's that the end of the Blessing Way, which is them, the square off between the two of them. Now, even then, I don't think necessarily you really think Skinner's a bad guy, but at the same time, the possibility is there for that, and you would believe
the
it.
People he'd be conspiring with haven't shot him in a restaurant yet, or thrown him down some stairs. So there's a belief that Skinner would be like, okay, I'm on board. The pension benefits are great.
But, we're, at this point, we're past things like, not just all the things you mentioned there, we're past things like him, sheltering Alex Krycek and kicking the shit out of him in Tunguska. We're past the point of particularly, the deal he makes in Memento Mori with the devil. The Zero Sum, where that's paid off with the Smoking Man. Whole chunks of stuff that even Mulder and Scully don't even know about, that we do, that he has done to safeguard them. Now to throw in the idea that maybe actually, Skinner's behind this terrible conspiracy that's been going on for 5 years, that, that he's ultimately going to lead to Mulder's suicide and Scully's death, is a bit like, no, it's just not going to happen, is it? And it's that kind of, it is a lazy level of plotting to get you to the point where, you can have You know, they like playing the idea that Scully particularly thinks Skinner's shadowy, because Gillian Anderson really throws some shade at him, and poor Mitch Pileggi's a bit like, oh, how much more do I need to do for you people? You know?
You guys realize you aren't the only two agents that I supervise, right? I don't get any of this crap from Dave, who works in accounting.
Yeah, right, and it's just a bit too much, and it's a shame, because the whole Scully plot in this is fine, but it feels a little bit like it's being laboured, I think, to get to the point where we need to get her to, that we've already half seen in Gethsemane, which is back in that room having that conversation. That this episode is building up to a point we know, and then obviously it takes it that one step further, doesn't it, where she collapses, and it's the kick-off of the final cancer arc. But it all feels a little bit like it's trying hard to get her to the point where she's got the evidence, you know, in her hands.
And I'm going to name the one person in this room. But yeah, and now it's more, and like, again, this is one of those things where I'm torn between, like, it's really frustrating, but it's also really baller, and I kind of admire the show's gumption in doing this, which is that all of Redux 1 takes place, like, during the framing sequence of Gethsemane. So that, like, 45 minutes of television later, right, you are literally only about 30 seconds further in continuity from the closing sequence where Scully announces that Mulder's dead. You get, like, 2 sentences more, her standing up, and a bit of blood landing on a file. And that's, like, the sum total of how far you have moved in these 45 minutes, which I understand. It is mildly frustrating, because, again, a lot of it's like, oh, but all this stuff is happening that you didn't see, and so don't just ignore that. But I also admire, like, the sense of, like, this is your first episode of your 5th season. You are a sensation. You're dealing with a cliffhanger that everybody's, all on board about. You're gonna, like, how are you gonna get us out of the gate? You're gonna move forward and be propulsive, and you're like, actually, what I thought I would do is I would tell an entire episode, the entire season premiere would unfold, having happened between the scenes actually leading up to the cliffhanger of the last episode, which is a very interesting structural conceit, I will concede.
It is bold, and it's purely, in many ways, I think they're in heavily to service this, like you say, this very JFK-esque monologue, conversation between Critchgau and Mulder. And I think...
Oh, yeah, because we haven't really talked about that, which is it's the best part of the episode, I would argue.
It is the best part of the episode. And I think it's, obviously, it's set, obviously, to all the stock footage that they get from, the last 50 years of American history, and going through everything, from Korea to Vietnam and all these different things that have happened. As Critchgau is explaining that, Roswell really was a cover story, and everything has been about creating this, the American appetite for bogus revelation, which, and I think there is some really good stuff in this. It's a really good monologue. John Finn delivers it brilliantly. He's a really good actor, and I think I think they even commented on this, making the point that, he did a really good job.
Well, they would applaud every time that he finished the take, and I think that R.W. Gooden described the monologue as, in the perfect description of Carter's writing, the yellow pages.
Which is true, and it's absolutely true. There's a lot to deliver. He does a great job, and I think what you touched on this earlier, and I think this is really interesting. Is what Critchgau says enough to change Mulder's mind? Because ultimately, you said this earlier, that the show is never going to become the show that debunks the idea about aliens. It's never then going to follow that through for years and years and years. This idea that actually there weren't any aliens, and that it's a human conspiracy, and that's what you're going to investigate, Mulder, and the entire mythology is going to be unmasking this. Even though Carter comes back to the idea in the revival, ultimately this is a high concept science fiction show, and people tune in. If they're not tuning in for the Mulder and Scully relationship, they're tuning in for the big science fiction ideas, the aliens, the monsters, that kind of thing. It can't do it, even though it's purporting to sort of invert the whole mythology. It can't do it in the end, can it? Based on this loaded monologue that sort of recasts American history. You know, I think it's brilliant to see unfold, but the show's never ever really going to go for it properly, is it? And I think that's one of the things where when you watch it and you can look at it as a piece of television and a scene that's really compelling and really well done, even if it's completely blatantly nicking from Oliver Stone. But it's the payoff ultimately isn't there, is it? Do you think? Well, A, do you think Mulder really should have believed it, and B, was it worth it for the fact we don't really get that long-term payoff?
Yeah, again, this requires like a massive leap from Mulder that is very difficult to sell, and I'm not sure the episode does it. But at the same time, and this is the thing that I talked about in Gethsemane, so I'm probably not going to go into it in too much depth here, but like one of the things that I really liked about Gethsemane was the sense of Carter grappling with the X-Files and grappling with one of the recurring criticisms of the X-Files, which was that it was too fantastical and it like didn't take its material seriously, and it wasn't, respectful of its audience's intelligence, and, it was warping history and warping the perception of history and also warping its audience's understanding of concepts like science, and it was doing a disservice in doing that. And like by doing that, it was, contributing to the coursing the discourse, but also building this kind of paranoia in American culture and kind of feeding into these impulses, which, are not necessarily ideal. And again, I think that Carter, throughout his work on the X-Files, is sensitive to this. I mean, I think we touched on this when we covered some of the revival episodes. I don't think that all of Carter's dramatic impulses, and again, I'm being very delicate when I phrase how I phrase this. I don't think all of Carter's dramatic impulses in the revival series were entirely dead on, but I understand a lot of where they were coming from, in that I think they were grappling with the legacy of the show as a series that had built on this idea of American paranoia and mistrust and sort of like conspiracy theory in a way that was very different in 2015, 2016, 2017 than it was, back when the show originally aired in the 90s during the Clinton era. And like having to come to terms with that, and Carter's way of revamping the mythology was a way of kind of trying to extract some of the more uncomfortable aspects of that, such as, what you could read as xenophobia in there, or kind of like some of the more extreme kind of rhetoric and stuff like that could easily have been misinterpreted in the 90s show. And I think that, like, when I talked about Gethsemane, there was an element of Carter around this time feeling very defensive against criticisms of people like Dawkins and like Sagan, who had said that The X-Files was a show that was not to be taken seriously, and that was, being disrespectful and being dismissive of science and also just of history, and of kind of like just patronizing and condescending and being nonsense. And Carter kind of grappling with that. And why I think the Krischgau montage in this episode works as well as it does, why it is to me one of the best moments in the entire run of the X-Files, why it's so powerful, and why I think it's essential to what the X-Files is that I think you could make an argument that this is as close as Carter gets to saying to the audience, and you're right when you mentioned earlier the bit where Mulder says, "I've seen aliens," and Chris goes, "Don't worry about it." It's basically Carter saying that to the audience. But it's basically Carter coming as close as he can to saying to the audience, this is actually what the X-Files is about in a very abstract sense. These are the details and the facts and the pieces of history that I have learned, and the history of America that, could be traced back, and there's some evidence for all of this in fact. Obviously the stuff involving Roswell and stuff like that's all, made up and conjecture and conspiracy theory, but things about like the growth of the military-industrial complex after the Second World War, stuff like the emergence of the Cold War and this idea of a kind of an out-of-control military trying to justify its existence and kind of creating a climate of fear. These ideas are kind of essential to Carter's idea of what the X-Files was, which is a show that is about being skeptical of authority, about questioning the official reported line, about like trying to discover some underlying truth about the universe. Mulder's truth just happens to be one that involves aliens, which are obviously, for the purpose of the show, entirely fictional. And there are a romantic veneer on that. And like that's the thing about the X-Files. And I kind of it's alluded to in Gethsemane when Mulder's like watching that tape of Sagan talking about the possibility of finding life, you know, elsewhere in the universe, and him crying at the thought because it's beautiful, because it's the idea, there's something hopeful in the idea that there are aliens out there and that we can find them and we can make contact. And even like Mulder's opening monologue here, and again we mock it for being flowery, and it is very flowery. But even then you have him saying that, you know, his journey, you know, isn't just about, you know, understanding, which is what Kriskow's monologue is. Kriskow's monologue is, here's an explanation of how America got where it is today. But Mulder's journey is about more than that. It's about recovery. It's about hope. It's about kind of finding a way to believe in something better. And again, this is very similar to like religious faith, which is why Mulder's belief in aliens is contrasted with Scully's belief in God. Mulder's belief in aliens, you know, allows him to believe in a better world and better people and a better system, and it allows him to kind of displace a lot of the anxieties that you would have if you were just, because if the X-Files was the show run by Kriskow, it would be really, really, really depressing. It would be incredibly bleak. It's like the government is terrible. The military-industrial complex is out of control. Everything that you've ever believed is a lie. Nothing can be trusted. If that were the case, the X-Files would be... And the X-Files, you know, at certain points is a pretty dark and cynical show, but if it embraced Kriskow's vision, it would be full-on nihilistic. Yeah. And I think that what Carter does by wrapping it in the mythology and by introducing the idea of aliens and by giving Mulder this quest, and again the quest is foregrounded in both Redux 1 and more obviously in Redux 2 to reunite with Samantha, finds a way to wrap this very dark kind of heart or very dark vision of the history of America and kind of the legacy of the Second World War and how that shaped culture and American culture and identity, and find a way to wrap that around, you know, to wrap something around that is a little warmer, a little friendlier, a little more hopeful, and something that is, you know, something that is warmer than that cold, bleak, black and white, nightmarish footage. And again, all of that is, you know, some of the footage is absolutely horrible. Kriskow talks about, you know, the atomic bomb and the images of the atomic bomb and the horrors that were inflicted on civil and populations by the atomic bomb and kind of the nightmares that would create, and how, you know, a lot of effort was put in to downplaying those and kind of like in order to justify the continued expansion of the military. The X-Files' emphasis on stuff like the possible reunion with Samantha is a way of taking that darkness and that stuff that the show is rightfully cynical about and finding a way to find hope in it. And I like that monologue because it's Carter kind of laying bare everything that the mythology or the conspiracy is a metaphor for. Everything that the show is about, in inverted commas, when it's not literally about. And again, like you see that even through this three-parter, where you have stuff like the congressional hearing on cloning, but you have that juxtaposed with stuff like the horse races. You know, because obviously you had the well-manicured man's interest in horses back in Tunguska and Terma, and here you have the first elder who's sitting down like at a racetrack just watching form on the horses. Where you have this idea of that's, you know, not necessarily about literal cloning or about like literal colonization or hybridization or replacement. It's a stand-in for fears about stuff like eugenics or kind of fears about experimentation on people or the reduction of people into chattel, into kind of livestock who are kind of abused and experimented upon, which is something that has happened, you know, across history, not just in American history, in world history as well. And you have Carter in that monologue with Kriskow saying, well, look, taking all of that out, removing all of the romance, stripping out all of the aliens, here is kind of like my accounting of what the X-Files is really, really about when you drill down to it. What the conspiracy actually is, you know, in inverted commas, because it's about dealing with things, the horrors that have actually happened. And it's very effective for that. And I think that while it was never going to be sustainable, and while the show was never actually going to commit to that, I think there's value in doing that. And I think that the scene works remarkably well. Again, John Finn's performance is amazing. The ending of the sequence, while it owes a huge debt to Oliver Stone, is also very, very effective. And I think that it's a scene that is necessary to have had at some point in the show. And while I'm not sure the episode around it is necessarily strong enough to support it in the way that I think it deserves to be supported, I really, really like it.
Me too. I mean, I think it's great, and I think it is the standout part of the episode. It is the heart of it, really, the heart and soul of it. After this monologue, after this sequence, Mulder just monologues his way around the rest of the episode, walks around a lot of bits of the DOD, looks through some files, sees some alien bodies, or they're not alien bodies, whatever. And that's it, really, until he gets to the end, and Scully's collapsed, and he goes to the lone gunman with what turns out to be, on the face of it, deionized water. And he's thought he's found the cure for Scully, and it looks like he hasn't. So it kind of ends on it's not really that dynamic a cliffhanger. It's more of a conceptual shit, you know.
Yeah. It's Carter kind of almost literalizing what he's done here, which is, you know, Mulder's been given this something that he's told is a cure, and it turns out to be just water. You know, the X-Files, you know, it's supposed to be this big mythic show about, you know, alien invasion and, you know, colonization, and Mulder reuniting with his sister and a quest for the truth, and, you know, sort of exposing all these dark secrets and kind of like vanquishing evil. And, you know, you've just had Christgau tell you actually what it's really about is the military-industrial complex in the wake of the Second World War, and, there's nothing really you can do about it. So you have, you have that kind of literalized to a certain extent with Mulder being like, hey, I've got a cure! And the lone gunman being, actually, it's, no.
Sorry, Mulder. Not really. But yeah, it's true. It's true. It does literalize it. But it ends a fascinating but flawed episode. So that's Redux in detail. Before we go though, we'll quickly dive into the mailbag. We've got some feedback on both hours really of Redux. So I'm going to cherry pick a little bit from people who've commented in the Xcast basement, because I did put a call out saying, give me your thoughts on Redux 1 and 2. So there's we might have a little bit of an overlap here, but we'll see how we go, and there'll be some obviously to read out in the next episode too. So Katie Doe says, Redux 1 was the first episode I ever saw live after a summer of trying to catch up with reruns. I still remember being so excited and awed by the scale of the story. The montage where Mulder names Blevo is still one of my favourites, which is obviously from... She has actually written Blevo. Well done, Katie. It's really taken off this now. But that's obviously from Redux 2. But it's interesting that this would be... It is an episode you come back to. You know, it's a premiere, and it's quite a... I suppose there is some level of scale to it all, really, isn't there? It's sort of... By the time you get to the end of the next one, without going too much into it, it does sort of wrap up a lot, doesn't it? It's sort of by the end of that one, it's like, oh, okay.
I mean, even just Christgau's monologue goes all the way back to like the end of the Second World War and charts an alternate history of America. That's even before you have like Mulder venturing into the Heart of Darkness. And the Heart of Darkness happens to be a bunch of grey corridors with red doors on them. But like, you know, conceptually, it's very much, and you have him literally going to that space from the pilot, the place where it looks like the cigarette smoking man put the little sort of chip at the end of the pilot, which gives you a nice sense of kind of scale and bookending there as well. Which is effective to a certain extent. Like I think there is a lot to like here.
Yeah, definitely. Chandru Ravindran says Redux 1 is incredibly flawed, but is still a fine episode that gets hated on a bit too much for its voiceovers. Sorry about this. Yeah, sure, the cop out beginning with Mulder not being dead is extremely clumsy, and those voiceovers are generally uninteresting to a point. Yeah, but I find the rest of the episode to be powerful in its own right. There's a sense of tension building throughout, and the performances are incredible. The score is also a highlight. This trilogy of episodes is some of my favourite Mark Snow work. That's interesting, isn't it? Because the score is one of those that I think might get a bit lost, actually, in this trilogy. Because it maybe... For me, it doesn't necessarily stand out as much as it does in the Biogenesis trilogy, where I think the music's fantastic. A lot of it playing off stuff that he did for Fight the Future. But what do you think about the music throughout this? Do you think it helps build a level of mood?
I actually really, really liked the Gethsemane score, and I think we sort of mentioned that there, particularly the ones that you have up the mountain and stuff like that, that you have these sort of like wonderful vistas, and Mark Snow's score kind of accompanying them kind of brilliantly. I'm less sure of Redux 1 and Redux 2, although I do, and again, I feel like we're jumping around here. You know, again, you have you have Carter paying homage to his favorite directors, where you have like the Godfather style climax of Redux 2 actually has a really nice sort of background track to it as well, I think.
Yeah, it does. I think you're right. We did mention the music in Gethsemane. I think it is a little better employed there than here. But no, it's interesting. That's, you know, it's always important to remember Mark Snow's contribution to all this, really. Karen McKenna says, just flicking between this and Redux 2. Redux 2 in particular is one of my all-time favourite episodes, where Redux is a deep dive into the mythology of the show. Redux 2 is entirely the human element of it. The hard decisions, the ramifications, the personal connections, the collateral damage, the emotional journey. That's interesting, isn't it? In that this is the information drop, you know, the chunk, you know, and then, you know, as R.W. Goodwin said, the yellow pages, you know, it's that, and then the next one gets much more into the humanity of it. I mean, would you agree with that? Do you think that that's intentionally the way this has been structured?
I think it is. Like, again, and I think that you can see that even in the way that Redux 1 is like, well, all of this is happening simultaneously with the framing device in Gethsemane, so that the plot, in a very literal sense, is not advancing over the course of this episode. It is very much kind of exposition driven and kind of very theoretical and very academic, which makes it very strange that I don't like it more than I do. I actually really, really like Redux 2 quite a bit more, and I think that's the nail on the head there, is that Redux 2 is an episode that has a much more human element to it, a much more a stronger emotional engagement running through it, and a kind of like, while it does play through with some of the stuff that we mentioned here in Redux 1, where it is, you know, the X-Files mythology greatest hits, you know, volumes 1 through season 4, there is, like, even within that, there's you're watching Anderson and you're watching Duchovny do really good work and getting really meaty material. Not that there isn't good material here, but it doesn't give them the same opportunity to showcase their range. Duchovny's, like, voiceover in particular isn't necessarily some of his best work. In Redux 1, I would contend. Whereas in Redux 2, there is an engagement there from the cast with the material, and it's very much focused on the characters as well. So yeah, I would agree with that assessment, actually.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Finally then, Dina Ferreri says, I loved Redux 1 and 2 when I was in grad school, because it was so cool to see Scully doing some of the same stuff I did in the lab every day. Plus, visually, it was really nice. I love the moment when she turns on the power and the bubbles rise off the wire. When Scully develops the film in the dark room is a great moment. I think about the anticipation and anxiety I used to have when I was about to get results from a new experiment. But this isn't an experiment. Here, Scully is getting the result about the origin of the terminal disease she has. The weight of that moment always hits me. That's a great read, I think, from Dina.
It is, yeah.
It's, you know, because it is true. She does talk about how, I think she says to the doctor, doesn't she? The doctor with the really weird piercing eyes. Did you notice that? Like, his eyes are really strange.
Like, I think that I did.
Didn't you?
That's where my attention was in those scenes. It was like desperately noting down exposition. Also, wow.
Yeah, no, they just, every time I see that guy, because he also was in, because he looks a bit like Robert Wisdom, but he's not Robert Wisdom. And he's also in another episode. He does. He's in another episode. I love the idea that Tony's
like, is this a Secret Pusher sequel? Question mark.
Yeah. He's like Sven Jarly in them all the way through. But it's like, his eyes are weird. Like, I just go back and look at it, right? See if people think I'm crazy, right? I really do think his eyes really put me off. Anyway.
Let us know if the eyes have it.
Yeah. But Scully says to him, I think, you know, it was quite a pressured thing of saying, I need these results. My life depends on it. Or something like this. I think, what is it she says? My entire life depends on these results. And I feel like for this bloke, blimey, that's a bit of pressure. Like, come on, Scully.
I'm actually due to go home in an hour.
But no, it's true. It is a big, in all seriousness, based on Dina's comment, it is a big moment for Scully, and that when she's putting all this together, it's not just about being in the lab. It's not just about, you know, trying to prove one of Mulder's crazy theories right through science. This time it's life and death.
No, and there is an element of that to it. Although, I feel, again, this is where I feel sort of a little bit cynical about it, because it feels like the show has kind of done the push and pull on this with episodes like Memento Mori, and even in Gethsemane with the, they gave me this cancer to make you believe. It feels a little bit like, we already know that Scully's cancer is engineered, and we already know that kind of, that it's rooted in this mythology. And there's a sense in kind of going back to that it is that kind of, for me at least, that sort of dynamic that kind of wore a little bit thin, where it's Scully, in a hospital setting, although it's obviously in a university laboratory, but it's her worrying about her health or somebody else's health, while Mulder is off wandering around kind of living the high life, or not living the high life, but getting to do cool 70s conspiracy thriller stuff. So, I mean, for me, I kind of again, Anderson nails every beat she's given. She's phenomenal, but it doesn't quite click for me in that way, just personally, I have to say.
No, I can see where you're coming from, definitely. Well, thanks to everyone who's put stuff in the mailbag. We will delve into a little bit more of this in the next episode. We'll come back to some comments, so stay tuned for that. But yes, as ever from the listeners, some fascinating thoughts there, so thanks, guys. All right, so we're going to leave you on a de-ionized cliffhanger now for the for the next episode. For when
it turns out Tony was actually watching Fringe this whole time.
Well, maybe I'm going to be replaced by a shape-shifting person from the other universe for the next episode, because I might not be back for Redux 2. Dun dun dun. It might be somebody
special
else.
Guest host Blevo.
Yeah. Darren and Blevo. I tell you what, that I think we'd all pay for that one, Darren. To be honest, you and Blevo for an hour chewing over Redux 2. We are. I am possibly going to be double booked for when we're recording this, but we're going to see. It could be somebody else, but it's someone. It'll be someone you know and trust and love who's been on the show before. Don't worry. So whoever it is, they will guide you through Redux 2 nicely with Darren, who'll be back for that episode as well. And it's been great as always to chew through this with you, Darren.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No, always brilliant. So what's happening with your podcast and your writing right now? What's new for people?
Oh, yeah, so I co-host another podcast called The 250 with my good friend Andrew Quinn. We release episodes weekly covering kind of the week in the IMDb's top 250 movies of all time. As patrons are listening to this, actually, Tony, they'll get a second chance to listen to your dulcet tones. Our anniversary special should be dropping sometime this weekend, depending on how frantic my editing schedule is, which will involve us reuniting with a bunch of our guests in a pub to talk about the kind of the year that's been in film news. So and in the IMDb's top 250 movies of all time. So we've invited as many of our guests from the previous year back as possible. We're really glad to have Tony. We also have Carl as well. Really, really looking forward to that. It'll hopefully be a good deal of fun.
We weren't in the pub, though, with you, were we? Sadly.
But you were invited. The invitation was open. The budget doesn't stretch, unfortunately, to cover travel expenses. Sadly. We're building to that. We need to get a sponsor in. We lost Sato Industries. But then also we have, as if you're not a patron of the podcast, if you're listening live at the time of release, we're not entirely sure what we will be releasing. It may be Martin Scorsese's The Irishman, if it has made the top 250 movies of all time. If not, it will probably be the Nicolas Cage 2014 classic Left Behind.
Oh my god. Oh my god, I've seen that film.
Listeners, you don't know what you're going to get. It's amazing. It could be one or the other. It could be brilliant. It could be one of the best movies of this year, or Nicolas Cage.
Please.
So, I mean, what could you not?
Please, everyone, I appeal to you, right? Please go and watch Left Behind so you can listen to this podcast, because I'm pretty sure it's going to be amazing. Because Left Behind is a special kind of bad.
Very fascinating film. We also spend a lot of time talking about Nicolas Cage, pyramid tombs, and the tax laws of Nevada state. If you want some more Darren in your life, you can also find me. I write at The Escapist magazine online, actually, at the moment. I'm writing there on Mondays, Sundays, and Fridays, which is a very odd way to say those 3 dates, because it's not alphabetical, and it's also not chronological. So Mondays, Fridays, and Sundays, you can catch me there, discussing basically sort of up-to-date, pop culture stuff as well. And I write at the movie blog, as I always have, but you can find that by Googling my name and movie blog as well. It's with a 0 instead of an O in movie. And you can find me online at Darren_Mooney on Twitter, where I'm constantly harping on about absolutely nothing of relevance, but it's good fun, and I quite enjoy kind of engaging with people on there as well. So feel free to give me a follow there as well.
Your Twitter is great, absolutely. Always genuinely great stuff going on. I think most people who listen to this know that already. But yeah, great stuff. Go and check all that stuff out, guys. So much greatness for you there. You can find me, as always, at AJ Blackwriter. My website, ajblackwriter.com. I'm noodling around doing various different things on there as well when I'm not doing it on the Xcast. But I will be back, even though I might not be back for Redux 2, I will be back more in Season 5, because I know a couple of people did say to me, Tony, can you do more episodes? And I was like, yeah, all right then. I'll talk more X-Files if you want. Fine. So, I will be back.
It's like that band from Popstar. Tony, Tony, Tony.
If I'm not back for the next one, I will be back for Detour, which is going to be me, Carl and Sarah goofing around,
which is great. That'll be great fun.
Well, we may well have sang Jeremiah Was a Bullfrog.
Oh, nice. Did you record it on a car trip?
We should have done.
Road trip.
We were going to a wine and cheese reception, together. So yeah, keep your eye out for all the new episodes, guys. We're going to be back hopefully on a weekly schedule up until I think April. We'll have a little bit of break over Christmas. One thing we're not going to do this year, however, is the X quiz. I'll put that out there right now. We're going to leave that because we're going to have a Christmas episode, obviously, for you in Christmas Carol, a Christmas-centric episode of the Xcast this year. So, we're not going to have an X quiz this time for the first time in 3 years. Marlene Stemme did a fantastic job last year with the Xcast, coming up with all the questions, and it's always the X quiz, I should say. It's always really good. There's nothing against anyone doing it, but it's one of those things where people hated it when I used to give them questions because I was an evil so-and-so. So everyone was like, please don't make me do a quiz, Tony. But everyone else who's done it has done a great job. And it will be back. We will be back. It will be back at some point. But this year we're going to go just full Christmas Carol. But yeah, we've got some fantastic, exciting episodes for Season 5 to come. We've got some surprises along the way. We've got a really exciting announcement about Fight the Future coming early in 2020, which I think you're all going to love. So, I've
heard this. This is exciting.
You may well be involved. Strokes.
I haven't heard that, listeners.
So keep listening, guys. Thank you for all your support and all your listenership. Whether you're a patron or not, either way, we really appreciate it. So Season 5 is a go. So until next week, as always, remember, trust no one. The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and hosted by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated team of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find the show on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, or inside our group, the X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, plus on Instagram by typing in the XFcast. If you're a fan of the show, why not support us on Patreon? Exclusive bonus episodes, early access to new episodes, plus become part of our Xcast community in the Patreon department. To see our monthly subscription options, just head to patreon.com/the Xcast. That's patreon.com/the Xcast. We'd love to see you join our Patreon community. We're also part of the We Made This podcast network at We Made This Pod on Twitter and We Made This on Facebook. You can find a range of shows on TV, film, music, and popular culture in general on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.